Good morning and welcome. On behalf of Contrast Security, welcome to Equifax Struts You. Thank you for joining us. If you're anything like us, this hasn't been a typical couple of work weeks. So it speaks volumes that you've carved out the time to be with us today. My name is Mahesh Babu. I'm a product marketing manager with Contrast Security. Like you, we have customers and IP to protect, a board and management team to keep up to date, and regulators and auditors to answer to. So we would like to use this session and frame it around the questions that you are probably getting asked. Things like, what exactly happened? What is my true risk exposure? How do I remediate in the short term? And what controls do I need in the long term to ensure this doesn't happen to me? And we would like to do it from the perspective we know best as application security experts. Speaking of application security experts, I would like to introduce you to our speaker, our co-founder and chief scientist, Arshan Dabirsiaghi.
Thanks, Mahesh.
Arshan, I'm sure this has been quite a busy week for you.
Well, yeah, as a security researcher my entire adult life and a big user of struts early in my career, yeah, this has been a fascinating couple weeks.
Sure it has. So before we jump into what happened over the past couple of weeks, I'd like us to level set on some of the inherent realities with how software is being developed today that led up to the events of the past week. Gone are the days where we build software as large monoliths and take months to years to do so. Seems like we're building more software faster than ever before. Arshan, how are we doing this?
So to keep up with business, we need to build software faster, and to do that, we rely on open source and third-party components more than ever. So today, between 70 and 90% of your application is made up actually by third-party libraries or frameworks. Modern software development is like assembling a car, and most of the parts come manufactured by suppliers outside of your control.
Oh. So what if there's a defect with one of the parts?
So if by defect you mean a vulnerability, then you now own the risk of it, even though you didn't code it yourself.
Oh, so if that's the case, then any application that I have that's using a part that's vulnerable makes my application vulnerable. And any other application that I use that part in is vulnerable as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. And even if the airbag is manufactured by some small company, but it's used in the Toyota, Toyota owns the risk of that airbag manufacturing, and it's the same kind of thing.
Got it. So vulnerable components means my software is exposed, means higher risk across the organization. So if that's the case, Arshan, what are our options to remediate, or what are our options to address this?
Well, when there's a vulnerability, you can wait for the supplier to issue a fix and hope that it works, hope that it gets shipped on time, hope that it's a complete fix, etc. Or you can rewrite your application without that framework or switch frameworks entirely.
Yeah, either of those options don't sound practical. So which means we're either delaying launches or making large unplanned investments. Both mean slower time to market at a cost.
Yeah, and accepting the risk and holding our breath. And maybe there's a hidden option number 3, which is to just put your head in the sand. And I'd suggest that some people don't even know that they're making the security trade-off. And maybe we're all here today because someone had their head in the sand.
All right, so we either wait for updates from the supplier, or rewrite software, or we accept the risk and hold our breath and go to market with vulnerable software. Either way, it sounds like the business loses and security teams lose.
Right.
Got it. And that leads us to Equifax. Now, we don't know if Equifax didn't have reactive processes to new vulnerabilities, a lack of inventory, virtual patching capability, or whatever, what their control environment really is. More information to come there. We'll have to wait to see how the investigation plays out to get those details correct.
Right. Either they didn't have the right processes, they didn't have a good inventory of their third-party components, they didn't have virtual patching capability. It's got to be one of those things, and no matter how you look at it, they end up looking negligent. The optics are really bad, and probably the truth isn't so great either. So it may be considered indulgent to speculate on the impact, because I'm definitely not an economist, but I've heard some experts say that Equifax might get swallowed by one of the other credit agencies. I mean, literally the company's going to dissolve and go away. What we do know is that their share price was down 35% last time I checked, and just about every piece of every government in the country is launching an investigation into them. I tried to put together a little list here. In a Congress where we can't agree on the color of the sky, 37 senators asked the FTC, Justice Department, and SEC to investigate the breach. About 40 state attorneys general are investigating and may file suit. The FBI has launched their own investigation. And maybe even worse, cybersecurity reporter Brian Krebs, formerly of the Washington Post, is on their tails. And so, yeah, none of us want to be in Equifax's shoes today.
Yep. Brian Krebs on your trail is never a good thing. Anyway, it seems like we've traced the events that transpired at Equifax to a specific third-party component called Apache Struts You, and a specific vulnerability associated with that component. Arshan, what is Struts You? I understand it's a building block for Java web applications.
That's right. And Struts 1 was a super popular library, the clear winner in the space earlier in the 2000s. And so Struts 2 naturally had a lot of the market, but as you can see from the numbers here, it's dwindled in popularity quite a bit. So obviously Spring has more than 10 times the popularity of Struts. Weirdly, it's still big in Asia. It's got a much larger market share there. But the important thing to remember is that attackers don't need you to be running Struts 2 everywhere, right? They don't need all of your apps to be running Struts 2. They just need it to be running in one place. So although these numbers show that their numbers are down, it's still popular enough to be really dangerous.
Got it. So all it takes is one application that's exposed to make your organization vulnerable.
That's right.
Interesting. So how do we know Struts 2 is connected to Equifax? It's interesting that with breaches, sometimes information is murky at best, but it's staggering the amount of information that's come out about the breach over the past couple of weeks. Great for us as security teams, and it seems like we're getting a better picture of some of the details.
Right, first we had kind of a flimsy source, a non-technical firm saying it was Struts with no other technical details, so we were all a little skeptical. But given the timeline, it made sense that it could be CVE 2017-5368.
Got it. And it seems like more recently, USA Today confirmed with the Equifax team that is truly the case, that it is what we thought it was. So let's dive a little deeper into the timeline of events that transpired leading up to Equifax. It seems like It was a busy one for application security, a busy one for Apache and the Struts team, and definitely a busy one for you, Arshan. Can you give us an outline of what exactly transpired over the past couple of weeks related to all of this?
Sure. So things started to go haywire back on March 6th. The Struts You team released an advisory about CVE 2017-5638, which was the expression language vulnerability. This was really bad. The Struts You team handled the storm relatively well. Unfortunately, they've had a lot of practice. The advisory patch and patch release all went out on the same day, but still the internet shook a little bit. Everyone with AppSec in their title ran around their companies looking for Struts too. We talked to a big telecom who told us the cleanup took over 4 months and estimated the cost just that vulnerability, kind of reacting to that vulnerability, in the millions. On top of that, of course, lots of ISVs had to fix their own software to include a fixed version of Struts too, as well.
4 months, that's a staggering number. After this, we had a lull in activity, correct?
Right, we all went back to our lives, and then in September, there was some more activity. Two vulnerabilities came out in early September that were classified as low and medium, and they weren't remote code execution. So relative to other Struts 2 news, everyone kind of hit the snooze button. But on September 5th, we had another earthquake as Struts 2 released a remote code execution vulnerability correctly labeled a high severity issue.
Got it. And because of the timing, this is the one that people wrongly associated with Equifax, correct?
Right. The vulnerability just happened to be announced really close to when the Equifax announcement went out.
Got it. But just as we confirmed yesterday, or a few days last week, the vulnerability associated with the Equifax breach was 5638. And interestingly, Equifax identified the vulnerability, the breach back in July. So there was a fairly material window between when the vulnerability was announced and the breach was identified.
Right.
Great. So Arshan, I'd like to understand the impact of all of this and how we as an organization understand our true impact, the true impact this breach has on us, and this vulnerability has on us. I remember us talking, and you mentioned that even if our customers don't use Struts 2 in their apps, they could still be exposed.
Yeah, massively, because lots of vendors use Struts 2 in their software. Some shops like Atlassian, the people who make Jira, are huge Struts 2 users. And Jira is the most popular bug tracking tool in the world. Just like the airbags, we own the risk, even if other vendors are making the software. So our playbooks for dealing with these issues have to include looking at vendor software and not only demanding answers from them when these vulnerabilities occur, but maybe more importantly, finding some way to protect ourselves from software that we don't control.
Absolutely. This is great. So to quickly summarize before we move on, it's the inherent risk with using third-party components that led up to the Equifax breach. We know the breach was related to the Struts 2 framework, popularly used for Java web application. And the risk is not isolated to your applications as a company. It is to your vendors as well. So the takeaway from me there, Arshan, is we need to ensure the vendors we work with have protection. And if we are using pre-built running applications, there has to be a way to protect against them as well. Now that we know what the true impact is and what exactly transpired, I'd love us to dive a little deeper into the specific vulnerabilities that were exercised. Let's start with the culprit at hand, 5638. What can you tell us about the vulnerability and how the exploit was carried out?
Sure. So Struts 2 tries to take user input from malformed content type headers and tries to build an error message out of it. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that this allows user input coming from that header to be evaluated. And so if it gets evaluated, that means the attacker's code gets evaluated and they get to run whatever code they want on your system.
Got it. So what is the short-term fix to this?
Well, hopefully the short term is kind of over because the patch for this vulnerability went out in March. But anyway, in the short term, you can use a WAF to detect or block it. But as always, with a RASP, you can do the same thing, but more accurately and with more context.
And how about longer term?
Longer term, we suggest there's nothing more secure than not having the vulnerability at all. So obviously, patching is a great move. And then we have to suggest at this point people move off Struts 2. In fact, we've been suggesting that for years, unfortunately.
Okay, so to summarize, in the short term, you could detect this at the perimeter, or use a RASP to do it more accurately, confirm with a higher fidelity. Or in the longer term, the ideal scenario is you patch or you move off of Struts 2 completely onto a new framework.
Right.
Great. That's the Equifax one. That's I heard that we are still this is still being exercised on our systems.
Yeah, so this is in fact this is an instance of a real world attack against our production SaaS. Of course, we don't use Struts 2, so this is just a harmless probe. So anyway, this is from a month after the initial advisory. So our customers and ourselves had been protected for a month, but attackers were clearly still finding gold when digging in other places, or else they wouldn't still be scanning. So it's interesting to note that within 24 hours of the advisory coming out, we were seeing mass attacks from China, India and Russia also being, there's a lot of attack traffic for this vulnerability coming from there.
Got it. So a lot of spraying and praying. Interesting. How about, so that was the Equifax one. How about, I know the newer ones that came out are troubling you as well, specifically these couple. Can you tell us about 9793 and 9804?
Yeah, so these are really the same vulnerability. As we've seen in the past with Struts 2, they'll release a patch and then they'll get feedback from security researchers and others that the patch was not complete and the vulnerability is still exploitable, maybe in a different way than the Struts team predicted. And so they're both attempting to fix a regular expression denial of service. And so basically all you need to do is, if you're using the Struts 2 URL validation mechanism, which is a core part of Struts 2 and you're very likely using, you pass in a certain malformed value and the regular expression will cause the system to hang when trying to analyze some data. And so this one was troubling for a couple reasons. The one first is it was marked as a low severity issue, which is absolutely insane. So if I had a cell phone and I was on a cruise ship, I could take down, a huge system running Struts 2 with just a few HTTP requests and possibly without authentication. So the severity was totally wrong, and it was kind of buried with the rest of the news. The commits were not very straightforward in what they were addressing. So there's a little bit of a lack of transparency on the Struts 2 team's side. And so, the good news is, I can preempt your next question here. What do we do it? What's the short-term fix? What's the long-term fix? The short-term fix is to use a RASP. Unfortunately, this attack is not predictable enough to be signatured. the input can come in, an infinite permutation of ways. So unfortunately, you need a RASP for this one, or you need to, in the long term, patch and move off struts too.
I see an underlying theme here. So in the short run, have a production solution to protect against this. And the long term, don't, if the underlying issue is the struts to URL validator, don't use it at all. Just move off the struts. Got it.
So this is actually the commit that fixed the issue. And so this is interesting to me. This has always been one of my personal hangups. It's not clear to me from the fix why there was a problem and what the fix did to address it. It's maybe I'm the dumb one, right? But regular expressions have this really opaque security role because it takes the hardest part of programming, which is grok structure out of meta characters, and it builds an entire language just around that. So I can tell some things are I can tell what they're trying to do, I think, in the fix, and obviously the behavior is not exploitable anymore. I tested it myself, but regular expressions continue to be widely used and a dodgy security mechanism at best, I'd say.
Got it. So some fundamental issues with regular expressions and the way Struts You uses them that's leading to this, and this is why you expect to see more of these going forward.
I do.
Got it. How about 9805?
Sure. So this one was maybe even overhyped a little bit. So it's a devastating vulnerability. It was a deserialization vulnerability. So all you had to do was find an application, use the Struts2 REST plugin, and send them an attack string. And the attack string would be XML. And the XML, you could pull well-known exploit code. In fact, one of my exploits against Jenkins from last year would have worked just fine here. It targeted an extreme deserialization that was taking place within the Struts2 REST plugin. So the bad news is that it's a one-shot attack, possibly unauthenticated, and it was remote code evasion, only limited by the attacker's imagination. The good news is that the Struts2 REST plugin is not very popular. So we scanned our own SaaS. We protect thousands of applications in production, and we looked through all of the libraries that they use, and we didn't find too many people using this library. And we asked some of our bigger on-premise customers, and they also said it's a relatively rare library. So although it's a piece of Struts2, it's not a very commonly used piece. Short term, difficult to signature. So WAF will probably struggle with this because there's a lot of permutations. There's a lot of different gadgets you can use to make an attack XML. And I pat myself on the back here. The RASP issues, there's no issues with RASP catching this. We have sensors in deserialization code, so it doesn't matter which path you take to get there. And then when there's malicious behavior occurring within deserialization, like trying to kick off a new process or other common attack, other common exploit goals occurring within deserialization, we can block that. So long term, same. Mahesh, you got this for me? Patch and move off Struts too.
Yep. So to summarize about this one, it's if you're using the REST plugin and it's exploited, the impact can be detrimental. But you're protected if you're only exposed if you're using the REST plugin. It seems like the prevalence of the REST plugin is very low from your analysis.
Right.
Very cool. Great. There's one more, 12611. What can you tell us about this one? Sure.
This one is also a remote code execution, but it's one I'm also not as worried about as 5638, the one that took down Equifax. So you have to, in order to be vulnerable to this attack, you have to be implementing maybe not a coding mistake, but at least a non-standard coding pattern, and be using a specific library called FreeMarker. So if you are providing user data into any FreeMarker tags, which are used to build the view of a web page, the data will be evaluated by the expression language. So if you put user-controlled data into an expression language call, bad guys can get their code evaluated, and that's when bad things happen. So again, you can use a WAF to detect or block it, but RASP is the better solution.
Got it. Great. So that was a deep dive into the different Struts 2 related vulnerabilities that we've discovered over the past weeks and months. Seems like some of the common themes are there's some fundamental flaws with the way Struts 2 was developed that may lead to more of these vulnerabilities being identified and exploited going forward. In the short run, while the WAFs can protect against a couple of these because it's easy to signature, what the majority of the flaws with Struts 2 with these kind of open, third-party components cannot be signatured against, and that's where RASP solutions come in. In the longer term, this, the ideal scenario is to ensure you're not using vulnerable frameworks, or you're doing you have enough protection against in your software supply chain to ensure you are using secure components, or you have protection against those components. Great. So that's we went through the specific vulnerabilities, Arshan. I know the Apache Foundation has been great about coming out with some guidance on how to address some of these issues holistically. What are your thoughts on that guidance, and how do you and what role do we at Contrast play in addressing those recommendations?
Sure. The Struts folks have been, very transparent and very professional about this. To their credit, they released a statement that had some pragmatic advice that doesn't just apply to Struts 2, it applies to all open source libraries. And so they kind of broke it down like this. The first part of advice was to basically create an inventory of the libraries you use, and then keep track of security announcements affecting them. So this sounds like good advice, but it's actually incredibly difficult to implement because you use thousands of libraries, right? And so this is incredibly hard to do at scale without Contrast. And so Contrast completely does this for you. You add our agent to your app, and we keep track of your libraries and which CVEs are mapped to those libraries. And you can even set up alerts so that when new vulnerabilities are discovered, you get a notice. So the second thing they recommended was establishing a process to quickly roll out security fixes. They said specifically, best to think in terms of hours and days, not weeks or months. So this is totally sound advice. I got into a fight with a journalist on Twitter the other day because he said patching is complicated, and he was trying to give Equifax some wiggle room. And if applying a patch release and redeploying is not possible in your company, in those timescales, you absolutely need something like RASP. Not everybody's a DevOps unicorn. I understand that. But the security requirements that we have today, we have to be talking hours. And for me, that's especially for older software, you absolutely need runtime protection. So the third piece of advice is to assume that all of your libraries will have vulnerabilities discovered. In a way that I feel like they're taking it easy on themselves here. Yes, all libraries can have vulnerabilities discovered in them, but they missed an opportunity to talk about how they're going to get better specifically. They've suffered several similar expression language vulnerabilities, and I have never seen them try to re-architect their framework to avoid their dependency on expression language and make it not such a central part of what they do. And then recently we've seen, as we went through earlier, we've seen deserialization, regular expression, denial of service. I joked the other day that the demo application that comes with Struts You is like the new web goat. So what I've seen is that I don't see that they're great at learning security lessons. They have a mostly reactive approach to security, and they don't have great security instincts. Remember, I mentioned before that they've had to issue after release when they get a fix wrong. So for that release season, I think we have to look into other frameworks to use in our apps. So recommendation 4 is more solid advice, establish security layers. I think they're a bit vague here because they don't know enough about security to frankly make a more direct suggestion like use a RASP. So layers is a good call. I personally don't find kitchen sink approaches to security really work, meaning just throw everything you can at it, but having strategic sets of controls in different places is a smart idea. Fifth was to establish monitoring for unusual traffic, and yep, this is what any good RASP and the FISP and WAF would do.
Great. So the common theme seems to be identify and secure both your code and third-party code, and do it quickly and at scale to be able to effectively reduce risk. So speed and scale both seem to be key here. So Arshan, I'm going to throw a curveball at you. There's a lot of great guidance here. There's a lot of great guidance out there in the security world. If there's one thing you would like our audience to go off and do right now, world, to benefit their Equifax-related remediation efforts, what would that be?
It's a good question. People might be expecting me to recommend a technical thing to do, or to say buy contrast protect or contrast assess. Of course, I love those ideas. And if Equifax had, they'd have $5 billion more to spend on creatively beating me up about my missed credit card payment years ago. But actually, I think what I'd ask for is for everyone to take this opportunity of rare visibility into application security specifically, and go fight with your management to get the ability, get the budget to protect your applications in production. Software is, something 37% of our IT spend and getting bigger, and the corresponding security spend is negligently low across the world. So look, you don't like me? Fine, great. Go buy another RASP or a WAF. Maybe not a WAF. I can't support that idea. But hey, listen, we're tripling down on software as a species, and the answers to a lot of the problems are right in front of our face. We just need the will and the want. We have to make the executives sit up and watch this titanic disaster of Equifax sink into the ocean. We don't need abstract risk scenarios for executives anymore. We can just point to September 5th and say, you don't want to be that guy.
That's great. Thank you, Arshan. That was fantastic. To summarize really quickly, it's these inherent risks with third-party components and the speed at which we're building software faster than ever that led to events like Equifax. The good news is Equifax and events like that are 100% preventable. The time is now to address this, to ensure application security, and it has a seat at the table. So the immediate next steps you can take right now to address this are ensure your board and the executive committee are aware of application software risk and the risk at the speed and the way at which your software development teams are going. Ensure your investments with the level of risk that you have. Modernize, and most importantly, modernize your tool set to ensure you're not only addressing the risk, but you're not holding the business back. That concludes our webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Arshan or myself going forward. We thank you for your time and all the best with your efforts going forward. Thank you. This ends the webinar.